and welcome to Demystifying Poetry, the podcast that brings everyone closer to poets and poems. I am your host, Tara Stubbs, and this episode I'm delighted to say that my guest is the poet Brian Bilston. Hello, Brian, and welcome to the podcast.
Hi, Tara. Thanks for inviting me on.
With over 500,000 followers on social media, Brian Bilston has become truly beloved by the online community. He has published several collections of poetry, including You Took the Last Bus Home, Alexa, What Is There to Know About Love, and Days Like These. His novel Diary of a Somebody was shortlisted for the Costa First Novel Award. He has also written collections of poetry for younger readers, and his acclaimed poem Refugees has been made into an illustrated book for children. So I was just saying to you how excited my brother is that you're on today. Hi, Tristan, because you have such a huge range of followers across the UK, I would say. What is it, do you think, about your poetry that makes it reach all of these different audiences?
I guess partly it's relatively straightforward and accessible. I mean, I don't really wrap up my thinking in too many difficult to unpack metaphors, or the language is pretty straightforward. So I think it's relatively direct, and I think people respond to that. People who are maybe generally more fearful of poetry. So it's quite an easy thing to read my poem and just have to read it once to understand what it means.
Mm-hmm. That's true, actually. And well, in a lot of the cases, I think. I also noticed on social media that you're very good at responding to comments as well. I mean, I know you can't respond to them all, but do you think that helps as well to kind of create a community there?
Absolutely. And I think that it gets increasingly harder to do that these days. But I do try to get back to people, not least because they've taken the time to read something that I've written and they've responded to it in some way. And I feel like I need to kind of acknowledge that. And it probably has its roots from early on when I was first on social media, in that even before I was sharing any poetry, but I found this sort of community that I could chat to, I could talk to about various things. So I've always kind of found social media as a place, not, I don't just see it as a one-way thing where for me to put my work out there. It really is an ongoing conversation I have with lots of people.
And I guess that literally makes poetry accessible in a way that we often think can't be because of things like copyright as well. Often we can't actually read very much contemporary poetry online because it's copyrighted. But you're much more generous, obviously, with your work. I
am, and I don't know whether my publishers would always like that fact. But again, that probably stems from when I started off, because I didn't really have any intention of labelling myself as a poet. I was messing around, sticking stuff up, and didn't really think about what I was doing anyway. And then when it became more popular, I didn't want to let go of that somehow. Didn't want to then kind of become closed off. And I think I do have a background in marketing, and actually I think if I hadn't been so free and easy with those poems in the first place, there's no way I would have had anything like the success I've ended up having. And I'm not convinced it's ended up cannibalising anything else I've gone on to do since. Also, one thing that I do quite often is I do post a poem up, and then I'll look at it again a bit later and think, oh no, I shouldn't have posted that up. And I'll tinker with it. And then a few weeks later, I'll tinker with it again. There'll be multiple versions of it flying around. And if it does actually end up in a book one day, it's probably very different to anything I've ever stuck up online.
That's fascinating. That's for future scholars. That's probably going to drive them mad.
Yeah.
They'll be in their Viva talking about you, and they'll say, no, but you didn't get that version that you published on the 10th of October 2024. How can you have a whole scholarly view if you've got all these versions?
The thought of future scholars discussing my work fills me both with horror and amusement.
It will be fine.
Okay, that's okay.
So wait a while till you're out of copyright, you see. That's the thing. So could you mentioned a little bit about how you started in marketing. Could you talk a little bit about how you got into becoming the poet that is Brian Bilston?
I've been writing poems, I suppose since my mid to late 20s, but they were just mainly for myself, or to celebrate occasions, for a friend, or sometimes for things at work. And but generally, I wasn't sharing anything I was writing with anyone. I didn't have the confidence, or didn't think people would be interested particularly. It was just for my own benefit. And then I was at work one day, and I heard some people talking about how we needed to optimize our social media strategy, and they started talking about things like Twitter, and I had no idea.
And was that a publisher's that you were?
Yeah, at a publisher's. And I had no idea what these things were. I mean, I knew what Facebook was, but I didn't really know what Twitter was. So I thought, maybe I should take a look at that. I'll do it under the cover of darkness, so not to appear ignorant. So I joined Twitter under this pseudonym, a name that I'd used in the past for various writing bits and pieces that I'd done, non-poetry stuff. And then I really liked it. I really liked the people on there were very funny and engaging, and they were creative. And there were all these little communities of, little poetry community, or people sharing their cartoons and jokes, and I loved it. And for the first year or two, I was just consuming stuff and responding to people who were doing, funny things or things that registered with me in some way. And I was, like a lot of people who joined Twitter, I was sending out bad jokes and getting retweeted once, maybe by my mom. And but then a couple of years in, I started to send these sort of poems out. In fact, I'm not even sure they were really poems. Don't know. They were sort of jokes, but with artful line spacing, and it just sort of took off from there. And it's still a surprise to me, because I didn't have any plan of doing any of this for a long time. I've struggled to even think of myself as a poet, as opposed to somebody who writes poems. Only just coming around to that fact now. So
what's the difference between those two things?
Well,
is it like a capital P or something?
Yes, it feels, I don't know, I always thought it's slightly ludicrous to imagine if you were visiting the United States and going through security, and you're sort of grilled and they ask you for your...
What do you do?
For your profession, for you to say poet. It just sounded just such a grand thing.
Well, is it also the idea that you could make enough money from that as well, to be your profession?
I
think that's not possible these days.
Yes, I suppose so. I mean, generally people don't go into poetry for the money, do they? There's probably a bit of that. And also, I mean, I think I probably had a bit of an attitude towards the idea of a poet, of being, they were always the sort of, they thought themselves kind of cool, and they were kind of aloof, and they dressed all in black, and they were just a bit annoying at school, the people who did really take that stuff poetry seriously. So it's taken me a while to get on board with that.
And I think having seen you live, I think what you do use really brilliantly is comedy, and you've talked already a few times about being funny. Do you think that's a good sort of superpower to have when you're trying to get people engaged with poetry in a way?
I think so. I mean, it's I couldn't really imagine doing what I do without trying to bring some humour to it, and I think people will kind of respond to that, and I think that's. I mean, certainly the way that I got into poetry myself was through finding some poets who were funny, who made me smile and sometimes made me laugh. And I don't think if I hadn't found those poets, I don't think I'd be doing what I'm doing now. Now, not everyone has a sense of humour. It's true. It must be said. I mean, I'm sure there's some more.
Yeah, and I think sometimes poetry is almost treated too reverentially as well by people. So it's not a place for humour, which is a shame, I think.
Yes, and there's a long tradition of poets being marginalised because of that. I think of people like Roger McGough and
Edward Lear, even.
Edward Lear,
Yeah.
yes.
And it gets branded nonsense verse often as well, doesn't it?
That's right.
It's very unfair.
Yeah, nonsense, or it's quite the doggerel word is quite.
Yes, that's another word. Yeah.
That gets thrown at me sometimes,
Does
and I
it?
think, well, actually, it's really good doggerel. So yeah, you do doggerel.
Yeah,
do it,
I get
do it
to say
properly.
I'm a poet when I go to the US. Do you?
Exactly.
Well, also I think it's also, for me, it seems to do with what you think poetry should do, and I think for you probably it's about getting to lots of people as well, right? It's not just the kind of space for 10 or 20 people to think they're clever. It's a more, I don't know, it's a more open-minded medium, I think, the way that you use it.
Well, I think so. I suppose I both have I mean, in terms of what I do myself in the poems that I write, generally, I'm not sure whether I'm supposed to do this or not. I don't tend to think about an external audience. So I still try to write in the way that I always used to write when I wasn't sharing it with anyone. I was writing it essentially for myself and trying to make myself laugh, or just having some kind of fun with language, or getting a kind of thought. Or I used to write quite a bit of kind of passive aggressive poetry when I'd be off on some sort of work sales meeting and have to spend the whole evening with senior managers, and then I'd scurry back to my hotel room and write this sort of nasty poem about the person I had to sit next to. Yeah, exactly. So there's that regard, but I think when I think about poetry more broadly, beyond what I do, I don't see it as one thing in the same way I wouldn't imagine music is one
or
thing.
Film.
Or film.
Yeah.
Exactly. There's all sorts of different kinds out there, and what appeals to any one person can be very different from what appeals to the next person.
But when I saw you, I was really struck by the way that you seemed to have a really good interest in pacing as well, and in peaks and those kinds of things. I don't know whether you plan that, but you know what I mean? You kind of go from the funny to the serious, and sometimes the ridiculous. And I remember the Frisbee poem, for example. I remember everybody completely losing themselves laughing with that one.
Well, yes, sorry about that.
Oh, it's brilliant. I love it. But do you think about that? Because I know a lot of your work's actually really political and, quite critical in lots of ways of modern life, for want of a better phrase.
Well, I do think quite a lot about pacing. Well, it was something I've learned, I suppose, over the years. So I still feel relatively new to going on a stage and reading poetry. And if I've got an hour to fill with poems, or sometimes I'll do 2 45-minute sets, that's a lot. That's a kind of lot of poetry for people to absorb. And if it's all in kind of one tone or in one direction, then people will just simply get bored. And so I do have to think about that quite a bit, and also it stops me from getting bored too. And so I've learned to treat it, I suppose, in some ways as a band might treat their sets. You got to have a strong opener. At some stage you can throw in a few obscure things that you're kind of trying out for the first time.
From your new albums that no one's listened to.
But you need some of the greatest hits, and some loud ones, some quiet ones.
Yeah, that's really interesting. There's also that sense, though, with you, as I said, that it can be quite political. So, do you use comedy as a vehicle for the political, or is it more complicated than that?
I suppose I do. I mean, it's interesting all those early poems, none of them were particularly political, and I think I became more political. I'd always been political outside of poetry, but I think being on social media politicized my poetry in some way, because a lot, my feed was full of posts about Brexit and Trump and all of these things. And it starts to rub off on you. And I think I realised that maybe it rubbed off on me maybe too much when I looked at the last 9 or 10 things that I'd written. They were all about Brexit or Trump. And I thought, come on, I need to write about other things too. But I think I ended up partly trying to make sense out of what I was seeing in the world. And so I was writing a poem in order to get my own thoughts together and how to express how I felt about a certain situation. But it was always, but the humour would always come into it, I think. Not always, but it would usually come into it, because if not, it was just too bleak. The thing I was writing about was just too miserable. It would make me feel too miserable. So I had to somehow introduce humour into it, and
a bit of levity, maybe. Yeah.
Bit of levity, and just point a finger at some of the absurdities in the situations that I was kind of seeing. So often I think that's probably where the humour in those political poems come from, is by
instead of despairing.
It's just pointing out the absurdity of it all.
And do you think that the Brian Bilston persona has been helpful in that regard, or is it something that you ever regret? I mean, I remember you saying at your event that I went to, your reading, that nobody takes pictures of you. It's kind of an understood thing, and I noticed nobody did. So you've got quite a kind of loyal following who are not revealing the real you. But does that something that you ever regret doing, or does it help with trying to adopt these interesting viewpoints on things?
Well, I think it does help. I mean, although I am Brian and Brian is me, it does just lend a little bit of distance, just a fraction of distance to what I do as Brian. And I think for a start, I don't think I would have been writing and sharing these poems under my own name. Wouldn't have had the confidence to. And also, I kind of think that kind of distance allowed me to become confident, and it allows me just to step back a little bit from what I do, and if something doesn't go quite right, or
you can just blame Brian.
Blame it on Brian, exactly. Nothing to do with me.
He was having a bad day.
Well, that's right. I mean, if this had been planned, I wouldn't have lumbered myself with the name Brian. I don't think I'd have come up with.
I wondered whether it was just because Banksy is also a B. Sometimes you get called the Banksy of poetry.
No, well, the Brian Bilston name came from the fact that I'd used it when I used to write things like spoof football match reports.
Oh, I see.
And Brian Bilston was like an Alan Partridge kind of name.
It also sounds like the kind of a name that you get at the bottom of the Sunday Times Culture, with people writing in. Actually, like my dad does quite a lot.
Right.
But, that kind of, the grumbling people.
Yeah. Yeah. So it's
Brian Bilston, Oxford. Yeah.
So I think the very first time I did a reading, having never read in public before, I was utterly terrified from doing it, and it was billed as an evening of Brian Bilston's poetry. But even hiding behind the Brian name wasn't enough for me. So I ended up, this was at the Chipping Norton Literary Festival, I think it was, I ended up inventing a whole other character who was a English professor at Oxford University. He's called Dr. Dylan Miller. Who was talking about the poetry of Brian Bilston, being quite disdainful
that's brilliant.
towards it. I had kind of
a third persona.
Exactly.
You're like the Fast Show, but in one person. I love it.
But it was only when I checked into my hotel when I got there, and I could have been one of 3 different names. I thought maybe it's a bit complex.
Yeah,
it's a bit too meta.
Might be getting a bit much.
Yeah.
Well, I can understand though, because it does. It must free you a little bit. I can see that, and I guess as well in this world where, once you have a name, you're entirely Googleable. It must be nice to kind of put that away, and still have separation.
Yeah, no, it's been, I do enjoy that because, I am shy. I don't really like any kind of attention, particularly in the real world. And it's been, not to say I'd be mobbed if I went down the streets.
You might be in Oxford.
Yeah. Well, not even here. But I think I've only ever been spotted out in the wild twice.
When they've
so
actually
far.
come up to you.
Yeah.
Because I've spotted you, but I've retained your anonymity.
Yes, well, thank you so much for doing that. That's kind of the way. That's the way I like it. I went a few years of doing all of this, and actually, without people closest to me knowing I was doing it. Either.
Really?
Yeah.
That's fascinating.
Yeah.
And I guess would it be sort of self-selecting, so they wouldn't necessarily listen to the podcast, so they wouldn't know, oh, that's his voice, or...
That's right. Yeah, they wouldn't. And I do get people who've got back in, who've lost touch with over the years, who've got back in touch with me and said, was that you I heard on the radio?
Brilliant.
It sounded like you.
No, it wasn't me. It was my brother.
Yeah, exactly.
That's so interesting. Thank you. I wondered if you could just tell us a little bit about your personal relationship with poetry, because for this podcast we've all been talking about about how much we love poetry, and then actually when we come down to it, we love it, but do we sit around reading it? Do we go to other people's readings? What do you do when you're not being Brian Bilston? Are you just sick of poetry at that point, or?
I think having worked for so long in a sort of 9-to-5 job, it's made me take my poetry in a kind of similar vein in some ways. So I do sort of sit down at about 9 a.m. and I will do a sort of proper working day. But in the course of that day, it's not just me trying to write. I will try to read some poetry too. I don't sort of schedule it in, 5 poems to read between 2 and 3, but I see that as part of my kind of working life. And I do a lot of reading, but the reading I do in the evening tends to be fiction or non-fiction. It's rarely poetry. I sort of consume it when I'm going about my poeming business.
It is quite surprising how sometimes poets don't seem to read much poetry.
Is that
so
right?
I'm glad that you're saying that. Yeah.
Well, it's also interesting. I mean, because I don't know many poets, because I've come up through this route that not many, it's not the traditional route. So I've never been on the poetry scene as such. So I don't have poets who I hang out with and say, what you've been reading recently, and so it's I
don't mean the big names. I mean more often people who are coming up and they're in workshops and they're saying, oh no, I don't want to kind of muddy my style. But how else will you learn what you like and what you don't like?
I do think it's important. I mean, I do, and with my reading, I do a bit of trying to read, new poets, and also I do keep going back to some of my favourites too. I think I read the new poets because I want to see what people are up to. It's just kind of interesting, but I go back to the old ones just because I often find them just inspirational. Just makes me think, I want to write like that. I don't want to write exactly that, but I want to
evoke what they've evoked.
Yeah.
Who would that be at the moment, do you think?
In terms of those poets I go back to a lot, well, I suppose it's some of the ones that I kind of grew up with. So it's people like Roger McGough, John Hegley. Actually, he was the one who first really switched me on to the fact that poetry was allowed to be funny.
And can be a performance as
well.
And
can be a performance, yeah. I had no idea. I hadn't... remember somebody brought one of his books into school, and it was really that was a real eye-opener. I absolutely loved it. I had to go out and buy everything that he did. So, those kind of people that sort of make me laugh. John Cooper Clarke. I mean, I don't tend to read John Cooper Clarke so much, but I do go and see him quite often whenever he's on tour. So I'll read all sorts of stuff. I mean, Billy Collins. Absolutely love Billy Collins. So I'd just happily spend half an hour reading, 4 or 5 of his poems.
And I think it's quite funny, isn't it, that what's happened to poetry is something that was basically oral and shared and part of communities has in so many cases become this very intimate reading space. And we don't unless we go and see you or something like that, we don't really hear that much poetry out loud anymore. I suppose you do if you go to maybe an open mic night or something like that. But even with your poems, I suppose, because of social media, they're engaging with it largely reading, aren't they? I mean, I don't think you record it very often, do you? Or...
No, I've a couple of my books I have done the audio for, but yes, it's mainly a written thing. But I was kind of thought, I mean, I get very blurred as to what poetry is sometimes, and I discovered John Hegley on the page before I'd actually seen him on my telly. But I suppose around that time when I was getting into John Hegley's stuff, the other thing I was doing, I was listening to a lot of music, but the music I was listening to were kind of bands, I guess, whose lyricists put quite a lot of time and effort and really crafted what they did. I was really fascinated in that. So I felt like I was listening to poetry back then, and I still seek that out now with the music I tend to gravitate towards. The words are very important to me, and so I think people probably still still listen to poetry even if they're not knowing that it is poetry.
It's kind of there even if they're not quite realising.
Yeah. But I wonder if, I mean, even going back decades, I don't know to what degree people would hear, poets on their televisions, John Betjeman I suppose you see clips, don't you?
Yeah.
But I think it's always been, you've always had to go out your way to listen to a poet reading their work.
That it almost becomes cultish at some points.
Yes.
Or slightly something people hide sometimes.
That's right.
Like it's a fetish.
Yeah. But I think that's what, that's in some ways that's what is potentially different now, in that social media has got the power to bring poetry into people's lives, whether they want it or not.
Well, yes, because you're scrolling through. Right?
Yeah.
I think I get you most days.
Yeah. So
on
sorry.
my Facebook feed.
Despite the
fact
you blocked me several years ago.
I've read that poem before, or at least in a different version.
but that's exactly. I mean, and you had those examples. I'm sure it's still happening now. Of there'd be a big event or some tragedy, and a poem will get shared, and it goes viral.
Your refugees poems get shared a lot, I think, isn't it?
Yeah, yes, that does.
For very good reasons, actually, but I think I've seen that in quite a few different contexts.
Yeah, but I see. Yes, sometimes just a poem will capture a kind of a mood, and it gets shared by people, I think, who wouldn't normally be interested in it, in any kind of poetry, because the poem has found them. There's someone and it's just popped up on their feed.
And then I guess it's really great because it actually creeps up upon them that it's poetry, if you see what I mean.
Yes.
So they might be engaging with the theme first and then suddenly think, oh, this is a poem.
Yeah.
And for those who don't know your refugees poem, it does a very clever thing, doesn't it? Maybe you could explain it so that I don't get it wrong.
I can't claim that I invented this form. I think there were examples knocking around before it, but if you read it from the first line down to the bottom line, it takes a sort of anti-refugee sentiment, and if you read it from the bottom to the top, which is the way I would prefer it to be read, then it's a poem that's supportive of refugees and considerate of what it is they have to go through. So there's a kind of it's like a trick poem. There's a kind of turn in it.
It's really effective, I think, particularly on that topic. So have you ever had any negative responses? You said that you sometimes it gets called doggerel, but have you had anything in audiences? I mean, I've noticed since I've been doing more public work around poetry that you get these odd people who come to things and then they say, I didn't like poetry and I still don't like it. And you think, why did you come?
Yeah.
What were you hoping that this hour was going to do? Have some massive transformative effect that you would completely change your mind? Have you had anything like that, or does it tend to be quite self-selective?
Well, most of the shows are because people are paying money, they generally want to be there. Usually where criticism has got back to me has been around doing political poetry.
I can imagine.
So I've had somebody mentioned to me that I was doing gig in, I think, Lytham St Anne's, and there were two people in front of this chap in the audience who seemed to be really enjoying it when I was doing, little poems about dogs and cats and things like that. And then I did some political poems, and they just kind of sat there with their arms folded through those, and then they left at the interval. They didn't come back. And so I get quite a lot of those, or people saying, "Oh, I wish you hadn't. I really liked it, but I wish you hadn't, read that one poem about the Tory party," or something like that.
That lovely one about all the things you'd rather do other than reading the Daily Mail.
Yes.
That probably doesn't always go down that well with certain audiences.
No, it doesn't. But I see that as part of what I do. So I'm not going to not do that. And actually, I always think, well, if you were there because you have discovered my poems on social media, you've obviously only read a couple of them, because this will come up. And
quite quickly, I think. With
and it's not from start to finish either.
No.
It's just there'll be some comments.
But if you buy any
poems.
of your collections, you will have quite a proportion, I would say, of political poems.
Yeah. I've had a few death threats as well. Yeah, I don't take them very seriously. They're usually from they're
in letter form, or
no? This is people messaging me on on
DMs
Facebook.
and things.
Yeah.
Oh, okay. Wow.
That's mainly in relation to one particular poem about American gun control. A poem that I wrote years ago that I absolutely hate, and it's never appeared in any of my collections.
It's like Yeats and the Lake Isle of
Yeah.
Only much more serious.
well, yeah, of course.
Don't think he got death threats for that.
No, but I think he probably,
grew sick of it.
Yeah. He might have got death threats for some of his other
probably.
poems, though. Yeah. Yeah. So
Wow.
I get those, but they're quite easy to ignore, really. Yeah.
And I guess because they don't know who the real you is anyway.
Yes, and they're across the ocean, so
It's fine.
So
I'm asking the same final question to everybody, which is, for someone wanting to get into poetry, do you have a poem or a poet you would recommend? You've actually mentioned quite a few poets in our chat.
Yes, I mean, I think that sometimes that could be difficult, because precisely what is the button that gets pushed for somebody can be very...
the entry drug, as they call it.
Yeah, that kind of gateway drug can differ. And, I think I said for me, humour's always been a big thing for me. So I was always... the people who got me into poetry were the people who made me laugh or smile. And, so one person I do go back to a lot is Roger McGough. I don't think for any one particular poem, but just his general humour and accessibility, but also just his take on life, which just corresponds with my own somehow. Seeing the absurdity in situations, in quite, in sometimes often quite difficult situations. So I always recommend Roger McGough to people, but that might not be your thing. Could be,
might put you off.
Yeah, exactly. You might not like to be entertained.
It sounds like that could be a poem. Roger McGough has put you off. Something like that.
Probably written it himself.
Well, thank you so much. I really enjoyed our chat. If people somehow haven't found you, which is probably quite unlikely, where will they find you?
Well, I'm on all those social media things, apart from TikTok. Not doing TikTok.
I feel like if you're over 40, it's a bit embarrassing to be on TikTok.
Yeah. No, I've only just got used to Poets Reunited being closed down, so I can't.
What's Poet? Was that like a
it's like
spin-off
Friends
of Friends Reunited? Oh wow!
No, I think I'd leave that one to the kids and the corporations who undoubtedly are all over it right now. So I'm on social, but I'm also in books and also bizarrely in theatres and art centres too,
which I would highly recommend. Thank you again to Brian, and thank you to all of our listeners. See you next time on Demystifying Poetry.